Howdy, partners, and welcome to tonight's tale from the untamed frontiers of the American West. As the evening sun sets over distant mountains, we invite you to lay down your weary head and drift into the mysterious world of Red Dead Redemption. Each night, we'll share different tales from these wild lands, where outlaws and legends still roam free. And when our story ends, the gentle sounds of the frontier, crackling campfires, distant coyotes, rustling prairie grass, and the soft whisper of the wind will carry you into peaceful dreams beneath the star-filled western sky, with no advertisements to disturb your slumber. Now, saddle up, partner, and let's mosey on down to tonight's tale. The evening shadows stretched long across the plains as Thomas Everett guided his dun mare along the winding trail that skirted the base of Stillwater Bluff. The last light of day painted the western sky in watercolor strokes of amber and violet, while eastward, the first stars had begun their nightly vigil. Thomas had been riding for nearly 3 weeks now, making his solitary way north from the border territories with nothing but his horse, Penny, and the sparse provisions that filled his saddlebags. At 42, he carried the weathered features of a man who had spent most of his life beneath open skies. His once dark hair now streaked with silver at the temples, his eyes bearing the permanent squint of someone accustomed to gauging distance across vast expanses. The journey had been a quiet one, marked only by the rhythmic hoofbeats of his mare and the occasional encounter with fellow travelers. Brief exchanges of information about trail conditions or water sources before each continued on their separate ways. Thomas preferred it this way. Years ago, he had ridden with companions, first as a ranch hand driving cattle north to railheads, later as a scout for wagon trains pushing west toward promised lands. But those days had ended after a violent encounter with bandits near the Redemption Mountains had left him the sole survivor of his group. Since then, he had chosen solitude, finding in it a kind of peace that companionship could no longer provide. Also, he told himself during the long nights when memories pressed too close for comfort. The land here felt different from the dusty borderlands he'd left behind. Greener, more forgiving, with gentle slopes that rose into distant foothills, capped by stands of pine and aspen. Yet it maintained that essential quality that Thomas had always sought in his wanderings: space to breathe, to think, to exist without the press of civilization crowding against his shoulders. Somewhere behind him lay the growing settlements with their wooden buildings and iron rails stretching across the continent like stitches binding a wound. Ahead lay only wilderness, or what remained of it in this year of 1899, when even the farthest reaches felt the approaching footsteps of progress. The air carried the scent of sage and wild grasses, punctuated occasionally by the sweeter perfume of hidden wildflowers that had emerged with the spring thaw. Thomas inhaled deeply, savoring the absence of coal smoke and the stench of too many humans packed too closely together that defined the growing towns he avoided whenever possible. Out here, a man could still pretend that the world remained as it had been before the rush of settlers, vast, untamed, and governed by natural laws that made more sense to him than the arbitrary rules of so-called civilization. He had watched the frontier recede year by year, pushed back by the relentless tide of humanity seeking to tame what some believed should remain wild. Part of him knew he was chasing something that would soon exist only in memory, yet he continued nonetheless, drawn ever northward by rumors of lands still largely untouched by the transformative hand of progress. As the trail curved around a limestone outcropping, Thomas caught sight of a small campfire burning beside a crooked cottonwood some 100 yards ahead. A solitary figure sat beside it, silhouetted against the flames. Thomas slowed Penny to a walk, one hand drifting instinctively toward the revolver on his hip before relaxing again. Years of lonely traveling had taught him caution, but also the value of occasional company. After days with no human contact, even brief conversation might prove welcome. "Evening," Thomas called softly as he approached, making his presence known well before he reached the fire's perimeter. "Mind if I stop a spell?" The figure looked up, an old man with a face like tanned leather and a beard that cascaded over his chest in waves of iron grey. He wore a battered slouch hat and a heavy coat despite the mild spring evening, and beside him lay a small pack and the tools of a trader: clean rags, small bottles of oil, and a leather roll that likely contained delicate instruments for repair work. "Free country still, mostly," the old man replied, gesturing toward the opposite side of the fire with a gnarled hand. "Coffee's hot, if you've a mind." Thomas dismounted, guiding Penny to a patch of grass before removing her saddle and bridle. The mare nickered softly, grateful for the relief after a long day's journey. Thomas took his time with her, rubbing down her flanks with a handful of dried grass, checking her hooves for stones or signs of wear, murmuring softly in the private language he had developed with his most constant companion. Only when he was satisfied with her comfort did he turn his attention to his own. He approached the fire with the cautious respect of a man who had learned the hard way that hospitality on the frontier could sometimes mask dangerous intentions. But something in the old man's demeanor, a calm self-possession that spoke of years spent navigating the complex social terrain of solitary travelers, eased his wariness. Thomas nodded thanks as he accepted a tin cup of coffee so strong it might have stood without the cup, its bitter aroma cutting through the evening air like a well-honed knife. At the old man's feet lay a dog of indeterminate breed, not large, with a brindled coat and one ear that stood perpetually erect while the other folded at the tip. The animal watched Thomas with intelligent eyes, but made no sound, not even the customary warning growl that usually greeted strangers. This silence struck Thomas as unusual. In his experience, dogs were often the first to announce potential threats, their instincts for danger more finely tuned than their human companion. "Name's Jeremiah Holt," the old man offered without prompting. "Most call me the Night Owl, on account of my habits. You'll find me between places more often than in them." "Thomas Everett," Thomas replied, settling cross-legged on the ground and savoring the coffee's bitter warmth. "Heading north? Though I couldn't rightly say where exactly." Jeremiah nodded as if this vague destination made perfect sense. "North has its appeals. Less crowded, fewer questions." He scratched the silent dog's head absently. "This here's Shade. Don't expect conversation. Haven't heard him make a sound in the 7 years he's followed me." Thomas studied the dog with interest. "Never barks? Not even at strangers or wildlife?" "Not once," Jeremiah confirmed. "Listens plenty, though. Sometimes I think he understands more than most men I meet." He refilled his own cup from the blackened pot nestled in the coals. "You'll be camping by the bluff tonight, I take it?" Thomas glanced up at the massive formation that rose behind them, silhouetted against the darkening sky. Stillwater Bluff, according to his map, a flat-topped mesa that stood sentinel over the surrounding plains, its limestone face catching the day's last light in hues of burnt orange. "Hadn't decided yet," Thomas admitted. "Might push on a bit further before dark." Jeremiah's weathered face creased in what might have been amusement. "No need for that. Good spot here. Protected from the wind, water in that creek yonder." He paused, sipping his coffee while staring thoughtfully at the bluff. "Course, some prefer to avoid it. On account of the stories." Thomas had spent enough evenings around campfires to recognize the opening of a tale when he heard one. He settled back slightly, stretching his legs toward the fire's warmth. What stories would those be? About the campfire up top, Jeremiah replied casually, nodding toward the bluff's flat summit. Shows up some nights. Been seeing it myself, off and on, for near 20 years now. Someone camps up there regular. Jeremiah shook his head slowly. Ain't no living person's fire. The claim hung in the air between them, neither challenging nor defensive, simply stated as one might remark on the weather. Thomas considered the old man, looking for signs of the yarn spinner's tell, that gleam of mischief that usually accompanied tall tales told to gullible strangers. He found none. Jeremiah's roomy blue eyes held only the steady gaze of someone recounting things personally witnessed. Thomas had heard his share of frontier legends, stories of skinwalkers that stalked lonely travelers, of lost gold mines guarded by the vengeful dead, of strange lights that lured the unwary to their doom in treacherous marshlands. He had dismissed most as the natural human tendency to populate vast, empty spaces with explanations for the frontier-bred superstition as readily as it bred self-reliance, and few who traveled its remote reaches remained completely immune to its influence. Yet there was something different in Jeremiah's manner, a matter-of-fact quality that suggested he regarded the phenomenon not as supernatural aberration, but simply as unusual natural occurrence, like ball lightning or the northern lights, remarkable but ultimately part of the world's fabric rather than exception to it. Ghost story, Thomas asked finally, keeping his tone neutral. Call it what suits you, Jeremiah replied with a slight shrug. I just know what I've seen. Fire burns up there some nights, clear as the one before us. No wood gets hauled up, no smoke comes down. Appears at dusk, vanishes by dawn. He stroked his beard thoughtfully. First spotted it back in '78 when I was running supplies to the mining camps up north. Thought it strange but figured it for ordinary travelers until I asked in town about trails to the top. And, Thomas prompted when the old man fell silent, staring into the flames. There ain't any, Jeremiah said simply. Not for a horse, leastways. Eastern face is sheer cliff. Western side has a game trail tight enough to make a mountain goat nervous. No reason for anyone to be up there, and damn near impossible to haul firewood besides. He took another sip of coffee. Yet there it burns, regular as clockwork on certain nights, especially in spring and fall. Thomas's gaze drifted upward to the bluff's darkened silhouette against the star-filled sky. No light was visible from its summit now, but the day had barely surrendered to night. You ever climb up for a closer look? Something that might have been discomfort flickered across Jeremiah's features. Once. Made it halfway up that game trail before shade here stopped cold. Wouldn't move another step, forward or back, till I gave up and turned around. He scratched behind the dog's ear again. Shade's got sense about things. I've learned to trust it. The silent dog raised his head at the mention of his name, regarding Thomas with those knowing eyes before settling back down with a soft sigh. Despite the talk of phantom fires, Thomas felt no prickle of superstitious dread, only the comfortable lassitude that came with rest after a long day's ride, and the pleasant company of a fellow traveler. What do folks hereabouts make of it? He asked, more to continue the conversation than out of genuine curiosity. Jeremiah's expression softened into something like fondness. Different tales for different folks. Ranchers claim it's old drovers who perished on cattle drives, gathering by the fire like they did in life. Miners say it's the souls of those lost in cave-ins and accidents, seeking the open sky they were denied in death. Natives avoid the place entirely, say it was sacred ground long before white men came through these parts. The old trader prodded the fire with a stick, sending a spiral of sparks upward into the deepening twilight. Shade shifted slightly at his feet, amber eyes reflecting the dancing flames as he settled into a more comfortable position. From somewhere in the darkness beyond their small circle of light came the haunting call of a whippoorwill, its distinctive song carrying across the calm evening air like a message from the wilderness itself. "You've been on the trail a long while," Jeremiah observed, studying Thomas with those weathered eyes that seemed to see more than mere physical appearance. I recognized the look, a man who's more at home under stars than under a roof, who measures wealth by horizons crossed rather than coins carried. He nodded slightly as if confirming something to himself. I was much the same in younger days, before my joints started reminding me of every mile. Still am, in most ways that matter. Thomas didn't respond directly to this assessment, accurate though it was. He had met others like himself, and like Jeremiah appeared to be, over the years, men who found the constraints of settled life more suffocating than the dangers of the open road, who preferred the honest threats of weather and wildlife to the more subtle hazards of human society. They formed a loose brotherhood, rarely acknowledging the connection directly, but recognizing it in one another nonetheless. Me, I've heard something different from an old-timer years back, a theory that made more sense than most, Jeremiah continued, returning to the subject of the mysterious fire. Thomas leaned forward slightly despite himself, which was, "It's a place where the weary-hearted rest a while," Jeremiah said quietly. "Not just any spirits, but those particular souls who knew loneliness in life, the drifters, the solitary riders, those who died with more miles behind them than companions beside them. They gather there," he said, "sharing in death the companionship they rarely found in life." Something in the old man's words resonated in a place Thomas rarely acknowledged, that hollow space carved by years of solitary wandering, of connections formed and abandoned as he drifted from place to place, always seeking something he couldn't name over the next horizon. He stared into the fire, momentarily lost in memories of campfires from years past, and the faces of those who had briefly shared them with him. "Well," he said finally, forcing lightness into his tone, "ghost stories surely make better company than silence. Appreciate you sharing it." Jeremiah nodded, seeming to understand the shift in conversation. "You're welcome to camp here tonight. I'll be moving on myself. Like to travel by moonlight when it's clear like this, less crowded on the trails." He rose stiffly, joints cracking with the motion. "But a word of advice, if you don't mind it." Thomas raised an eyebrow in query. "If you see the fire up there tonight," Jeremiah said, his voice low, "don't go climbing up. Just sit quiet and listen to the night. Sometimes—" He paused, seeming to weigh his next words carefully. "Sometimes you might hear things carried on the wind. Conversations, laughter, even music faint-like. It's not meant for the living to approach, but there's no harm in listening from a distance." Before Thomas could respond, the old trader had gathered his few possessions, whistled softly to Shade, and bid him good evening. Man and dog melted into the gathering darkness with the practiced ease of those accustomed to navigating by starlight, leaving Thomas alone beside the fire with the coffee pot and his thoughts for company. For a time he sat motionless, listening to the subtle symphony of the plains at night, the distant yip of coyotes, the rustling of night creatures in the brush, the soft snorts and shifting of Penny as she grazed nearby. It was a familiar soundtrack to his solitary existence, one that usually brought comfort rather than loneliness. Yet tonight, Jeremiah's story had awakened an awareness of absence he usually managed to ignore, the space beside him where a companion might sit, the silence where conversation might flow. Memory carried him back across the years to campfires long extinguished, to evenings spent with fellow cowboys spinning yarns that grew taller with each telling, to nights beside army scouts planning routes through hostile territory, to quiet moments shared with the Shoshone woman who had briefly traveled alongside him before tuberculosis had claimed her one bitter winter. What was her name? Waking Dove. Yes, she had taught him to read the night sky differently, sharing stories of star patterns that differed from those he had learned as a boy back east. For nearly 2 years they had wandered together, finding in each other's company a respite from the particular loneliness that came from never quite belonging anywhere. Her death had been the first crack in his willingness to forge connections, though not the last. Thomas stirred the coals with a stick, watching orange embers spiral upward like earthbound stars seeking to rejoin their celestial brethren. How long had it been since he had allowed himself to truly know another person, or permitted himself to be known in return? The casual camaraderie of trail encounters offered momentary respite from isolation without the vulnerability of genuine connection. A compromise that had seemed reasonable until Jeremiah's tale of spiritual gatherings had forced him to confront the ultimate consequence of his chosen solitude. Would there be anyone to remember Thomas Everett when his wandering finally ceased? Anyone to mark his passing with more than casual observation that a familiar face no longer appeared at familiar waypoints? With a sigh, Thomas rose and set about establishing his own camp, reusing the fire ring Jeremiah had left. He unsaddled Penny, brushed her down, and secured her with a long tether that would allow grazing but prevent wandering. From his saddlebags came a small pot, coffee of his own, jerky and hardtack, the sparse provisions of a man accustomed to traveling light. Routine tasks occupied his hands while his mind drifted, caught between dismissing the old trader's tale as frontier superstition and finding himself oddly drawn to the possibility it contained. Night had fully claimed the land by the time he'd finished eating his simple meal. The fire burned low, casting a small circle of light that seemed to emphasize rather than dispel the vast darkness surrounding him. Without conscious intent, Thomas found his gaze drawn upward to the looming presence of Stillwater Bluff, now just a deeper shadow against the star-filled sky. There, on the flat summit, a pinprick of orange light flickered into existence. Thomas blinked, wondering if his eyes were playing tricks after staring too long into his own campfire. But the light remained, steady and distinct, exactly where Jeremiah had described it. A campfire atop an isolated bluff with no easy access and no reason for human presence. As he watched, the distant flame seemed to strengthen, burning with a clarity that should have been impossible at such distance in the darkness. Well, Thomas murmured to himself, there it is, sure enough. He removed his hat, running a hand through hair grown longer than he typically allowed during his infrequent visits to towns where barbers plied their trade. The physical gesture anchored him in the present moment, confirming that he was indeed awake and witnessing something that defied easy explanation. Thomas had never considered himself particularly imaginative. His mind tended toward the practical rather than the fanciful, which made the experience all the more unsettling. He had seen many strange things during his years on the frontier, inexplicable lights dancing above remote marshes on moonless nights, shadow figures that appeared to pace alongside riders for miles before vanishing when addressed directly. Weather patterns that changed with unnatural suddenness in ways that made old-timers cross themselves and speak in hushed tones of angry spirits. Yet this manifestation struck him differently. There was no sense of threat or wrongness about it, just the simple impossibility of a campfire burning where no fire should be. The rational part of his mind immediately sought explanations. Perhaps there was an easier trail he didn't know about, or someone had established a permanent camp up there. or it was simply some natural phenomenon that resembled firelight from a distance. Yet none of these possibilities felt particularly convincing as he watched the steady glow that seemed both ordinary and impossible in equal measure. He thought of Jeremiah's advice against climbing up to investigate, and of the silent dog that had refused to approach. No great hardship to follow that guidance, Thomas decided. He had no desire to navigate an unfamiliar, treacherous trail in darkness, ghost fire or no ghost fire. Still, curiosity pulled at him, along with something less definable, a peculiar sense of invitation, as if the distant light beckoned specifically to him across the intervening space. Pushing such fanciful notions aside, Thomas added wood to his own fire and settled back against his saddle, drawing a blanket around his shoulders against the growing chill of the spring night. He would sleep soon enough, but for now he found himself oddly reluctant to surrender consciousness while that mysterious light burned above him. Instead, he lit his pipe, drawing the sweet tobacco smoke into his lungs as he contemplated the phenomenon. The night deepened around him, stars wheeling slowly overhead in their ancient patterns. Thomas's fire burned down to coals, but he made no move to rebuild it, allowing the darkness to enfold him more completely. Without the immediate glare, his eyes adjusted further, and the distant campfire atop the bluff seemed to grow more distinct. Not larger, but somehow more present, as if the distance between observer and observed had diminished through some means other than physical movement. And then, carried on a breeze that stirred the hair at his temples, Thomas heard it, the faint, unmistakable sound of human voices. Not clear enough to distinguish words, but the cadence of conversation drifted down from the bluff, punctuated occasionally by what might have been laughter. Thomas sat perfectly still, pipe forgotten in his hand, straining to capture these ghostly fragments of sound. Logic insisted they must be tricks of the wind, or perhaps distant travelers on some unseen road. Anything but disembodied voices accompanying an impossible fire. Yet the quality of the sounds matched their source perfectly. They came from the bluff, from the vicinity of that steady flame that should not exist. For a moment, Thomas considered packing up and riding on, putting distance between himself and whatever strangeness occupied Stillwater Bluff. He had never been an especially superstitious man, but neither was he foolhardy in the face of the unexplained. Yet something held him in place, not fear, but an unexpected sense of comfort, almost of recognition, as if the distant voices spoke in tones he'd been waiting to hear without realizing it. As he listened, the formless sounds began to resolve into more distinct elements, still not clear enough for specific words, but recognizable now as multiple voices, engaged in the relaxed conversation of those with no particular place to be and no pressing matters to discuss. The easy rhythm of trail stories being shared, of experiences recounted, of the gentle ribbing that develops between those who have traveled long roads together. Occasionally, a burst of laughter would rise above the general murmur, carried down from the bluff with remarkable clarity despite the distance. One voice in particular seemed to recur, deeper than the others, with the unhurried cadence of a born storyteller holding his audience rapt with well-chosen words delivered at deliberate pace. Another spoke rarely but with evident authority, brief contributions receiving respectful silence before conversation resumed. A third contributed frequent comments that sparked those ripples of laughter, the designated wit of the gathering, whose observations lightened even serious discussion. It was the sound of companionship in its most fundamental form, the simple acknowledgement between human beings that none of them faced the vast emptiness of existence entirely alone. Thomas recognized the pattern from 100 campfires shared throughout his life, that unique social alchemy that occurred when strangers or casual acquaintances found themselves circled around flames in the wilderness, temporarily bonded by shared experience and the ancient human instinct to find safety in numbers during darkness's reign. Thomas felt something loosen in his chest, a tightness he hadn't recognized until it began to release. How long had it been since he'd sat around a fire with companions he trusted, sharing nothing more significant than the comfort of each other's presence? Years, perhaps. Decades, more likely. He had grown so accustomed to solitude that he had forgotten what he'd sacrificed to maintain it. The easy communion of shared silence. The unspoken understanding that passed between those who faced the same horizons together. A new sound joined the distant voices. The strumming of guitar strings, hesitant at first, then finding their melody. No tune Thomas recognized, just simple chords that complemented rather than interrupted the flow of conversation. The music drifted down from the bluff like something physical, weaving through the night air and wrapping around him where he sat, a solitary listener to a gathering he couldn't join, but suddenly, desperately needed to witness. Without conscious decision, Thomas found himself stretching out on his bedroll, head pillowed on his saddle, gaze fixed on that distant flame as the guitar played on. He should have felt unsettled, perhaps even frightened by these impossible manifestations. Instead, a profound peace settled over him, deeper than anything mere sleep could provide. The voices from the bluff didn't intrude upon his solitude, but somehow transformed it, as if their distant communion extended an invisible circle that encompassed him as well. Not present among them, but nonetheless included in some essential way. The guitar player shifted to a slower melody, and now a single voice rose above the others, singing in a clear tenor that carried across the distance with surprising clarity. Thomas couldn't make out all the words, but fragments reached him. Something about long trails and faithful companions, about stars that guided wanderers home, about fires that burned welcome for those who had journeyed too far alone. The song spoke of shared hardships that forged bonds stronger than blood, of thunderstorms weathered beneath makeshift shelters, of meals divided equally no matter how meager, of wounds tended by unpracticed but willing hands, of stories exchanged during long nights when sleep proved elusive. It acknowledged the price of the wanderer's life, missed connections with those who remained in place, children growing to adulthood in absence, loves surrendered to the calling of distant horizons. Yet it affirmed the choice nonetheless, celebrating the freedom found in movement, the wisdom gained through varied experience, the self-acknowledge that came from testing oneself against the world's wild edges. As the song continued, Thomas felt a curious resonance within himself, recognition of experiences so similar to his own that the unknown singer might have plucked them directly from his memories. How many times had he stood atop a ridge, watching sunset paint landscapes no brush could capture? How often had companions, temporary and permanent, ridden alongside him for a while, before paths diverged? The song gave voice to emotions he had never articulated, even to himself, expressing with elegant simplicity the complex relationship between solitude and connection that defined the wanderer's existence. Thomas's eyelids grew heavy, the distant song weaving itself into the threshold between wakefulness and dreams. As consciousness began to slip away, he experienced a curious sensation, not that he listened to faraway strangers, but that he himself sat among them, welcomed into that circle of light atop the bluff. One more traveler, finding momentary respite among those who understood the particular solitude of endless horizons. The boundaries between observer and observed, between present reality and ephemeral manifestation, seemed to dissolve like morning mist beneath strengthening sun. His last waking thought was not of ghosts or supernatural occurrences, but of belonging, the simple, profound comfort of finding oneself among kindred spirits, whether for a night or a lifetime. As sleep claimed him completely, the song from the bluff seemed to follow him down into dreams, its melody becoming the current that carried him into deeper waters. The grey light of pre-dawn found Thomas still asleep beside the cold ashes of his fire, his features relaxed in an expression of unusual peace. A meadowlark's liquid call finally penetrated his consciousness, drawing him reluctantly back to the waking world. He sat up slowly, momentarily disoriented by how deeply he had slept. He who had spent decades sleeping with one eye open, alert to every nocturnal sound that might signal danger on the trail. His first conscious action was to look up toward the summit of Stillwater Bluff. As expected, no flame burned there now. No evidence remained of the gathering he had witnessed through ears rather than eyes. In the growing light, the bluff revealed itself as simply what it appeared to be, an imposing limestone formation rising from the surrounding plains, its face too sheer for easy climbing, its top accessible only by the treacherous game trail Jeremiah had mentioned. Just a dream then, Thomas murmured, though he didn't believe it even as the words left his lips. The memory remained too vivid, too present. The voices, the laughter, the guitar's melody, all carried to him across a distance that should have swallowed such sounds completely. Dream or reality, the experience had left him feeling subtly but fundamentally changed, as if some long-knotted tension within him had finally begun to unravel. He rose and went about his morning routine with practiced efficiency, building a small fire, brewing coffee, checking on Penny, who grazed contentedly nearby. The ordinary tasks anchored him back in the tangible world of flesh and bone, of hunger and thirst, of miles yet to travel before his next destination, wherever that might be. Yet, even as his hands moved through familiar motions, his thoughts kept returning to the night's experience, turning it over like a strange coin found on a familiar path. As he sipped his coffee, Thomas's attention was drawn to something he hadn't noticed in the previous evening's darkness. A narrow trail leading toward the western base of the bluff, barely more than a game path beaten into the prairie grass. Without consciously deciding to do so, he found himself following it, coffee cup still in hand, drawn by the same explicable pull he had felt the night before. The trail wound through tall grass and scattered brush for perhaps a quarter mile before ending at the bluff's western face, where the limestone wall rose steep but not entirely sheer. Here, just as Jeremiah had described, a precarious path zigzagged upward, not suitable for horses and challenging even for a man on foot, but not impossible. Thomas stood at its base, looking upward toward the summit that remained hidden from this angle, considering. By rights, he should be continuing his journey. The sun was rising, burning away the morning mist, promising another day of good traveling weather that shouldn't be wasted. Yet something held him there, staring at that difficult path with a pull that felt almost like obligation, as if he had been extended an invitation that required acknowledgement, even if he chose not to accept it. Against his better judgment, Thomas set down his empty coffee cup and began to climb. The path was as treacherous as it had appeared from below, narrow in places with loose rock underfoot and few stable handholds. A fall wouldn't necessarily be fatal, but it would certainly result in serious injury, especially for a man traveling alone with no guarantee of assistance. Yet Thomas found himself navigating upward with surprising confidence, as if his body remembered a route his mind had never traveled. The ascent took the better part of an hour, with several places requiring careful traversal on all fours. Sweat dampened Thomas's shirt despite the morning coolness, and his breathing came heavier as he neared the summit. Finally, with one last scramble up a particularly steep section, he pulled himself onto the flat top of Stillwater Bluff and rose to his feet, catching his breath as he surveyed his surroundings. The summit proved larger than it had appeared from below, an area of perhaps 2 acres, relatively flat and covered with short prairie grass, scattered boulders, and the occasional stunted juniper that had somehow taken root in the thin soil. The elevation provided spectacular views in all directions, rolling plains stretching toward distant mountains in the west, the ribbon of a river winding southward, and far to the east, the faint smudge on the horizon that likely marked a settlement of some kind. But it was what lay at the center of this elevated island that captured and held Thomas's attention. There, in a small depression sheltered from the strongest winds, lay a circle of blackened stones. A fire ring, long established by the look of it, with the unmistakable signs of countless fires having burned within its boundaries. Around this circle, arranged as if for comfortable seating, were several worn boulders and the remains of what might have been crude benches fashioned from fallen logs. Thomas approached slowly, the hair on the back of his neck rising. By all appearances, this was a well-used campsite, the kind established over years by regular visitors, yet Jeremiah had insisted there was no practical reason for anyone to camp atop this isolated bluff, with its difficult access and lack of water or other resources that would make it a desirable location. Moreover, no ashes remained within the fire ring, only the blackened stones and hard-packed earth that spoke of heat repeatedly applied and cooled over a very long time. Kneeling beside the fire ring, Thomas examined it more closely. No recent disturbance of the soil, no fresh marks of human presence, yet the area radiated a sense of recent occupation that defied rational explanation. Scattered nearby, partially hidden in the short grass, he found small items that only increased the mystery. A tarnished harmonica missing several reeds, a carved wooden button from a style of coat not seen in decades, a rusted spur with a rowel that no longer turned, a tobacco pouch so weathered that the leather crumbled at his touch. Artifacts of human passage left behind by travelers long gone, or perhaps, if Jeremiah's tale held truth, by travelers of a different sort entirely. As Thomas explored further, a flash of reflected sunlight caught his eye from beneath one of the crude benches. Reaching down, his fingers closed around something smooth and cool. A small tin cup, its surface worn by handling but untouched by rust. He turned it over in his hands, finding no distinctive marks or identification, just a simple drinking vessel of the kind carried by millions of travelers across the frontier. Yet something about its presence here, hidden yet preserved, struck him as profoundly significant. The cup bore the subtle indentations and polishing that came only from years of use. The slight asymmetry where a thumb had habitually pressed against its side while drinking, the faint ring inside marking the typical fill level, the barely perceptible dent near the base where it had been dropped on stone and carefully hammered back into shape by an owner who valued even such a commonplace possession. This was no discarded trash, but a personal item that had accompanied someone through countless meals taken in solitude or shared company, a humble vessel that had contained coffee to ward off morning chill, water to slake trail dust thirst, perhaps occasionally whiskey to celebrate arrival or mourn departure. Thomas ran his thumb across the cup's worn edge, feeling an inexplicable connection to its unknown owner. How many sunrises had this cup witnessed? How many campfires had reflected off its metal surface? What stories had been exchanged across fires while it warmed hands grown stiff with cold or age? The object seemed to carry echoes of those moments within its simple form, memories preserved somehow in metal that had outlasted the hands that once held it. Before he could examine it further, a sound froze him in place, the soft scuff of footsteps on stone, approaching from the direction of the trail he had climbed. Thomas straightened, one hand moving instinctively toward his revolver as he turned to face the unexpected visitor. The figure that emerged at the bluff's edge was immediately familiar. Jeremiah Holt, the night owl trader, looking considerably less surprised to find Thomas here than Thomas was to see him. Behind the old man padded Shade, the silent dog, watching Thomas with those same knowing eyes that had assessed him the previous evening. Curiosity got the better of caution, I see, Jeremiah remarked mildly, approaching with the unhurried gait of someone who expected to find exactly what he had found. Thomas relaxed slightly, though questions crowded his mind. "Thought you'd moved on last night," he said, neither question nor accusation, merely observation. Jeremiah shrugged, coming to stand beside the cold fire ring. "Circled back this morning? Figured I might find you here?" His gaze dropped to the tin cup still clutched in Thomas's hand. "Ah, I see you've found something. Been here a while from the look of it," Thomas replied, holding up the cup. "Like all of this," he gestured toward the fire ring and the scattered artifacts he had discovered. "Someone comes here regular, someone real enough to leave things behind." A smile tugged at the corners of Jeremiah's beard. "Real enough," he agreed cryptically, "though perhaps not in the way you're thinking." Thomas studied the old trader's face, searching for signs of the trickster or the madman, and finding neither. Only that same steady gaze that had watched him across the fire the previous night, assessing without judgment. "You've been here before," Thomas said, a statement rather than a question. "More than just that one time you mentioned." Jeremiah nodded slowly. "Many times over many years. And you've seen them," again not a question, "the ones who gather by the fire." The old man's expression softened into something like fondness mixed with reverence. "Seen isn't quite the right word," he said carefully. "Glimpsed, perhaps. Sensed. Heard, certainly, on the right nights when the wind carries sound in particular ways." He regarded Thomas with sudden intensity. "But you know this already. You heard them last night yourself." Thomas couldn't deny it, though part of him still struggled with the reality of what had occurred. "I heard something," he acknowledged. "Voices, music, as if a gathering took place up here, though I saw nothing but the distant fire." "That's how it usually begins," Jeremiah said, lowering himself onto one of the crude benches with the careful movements of age. Shade settled at his feet, watching both men with attentive silence. The fire first visible from below, then sounds carried on the wind. For most, that's all there ever is, a curiosity glimpsed from a distance, a story to tell around other fires. "But not for you," Thomas observed, noting the personal knowledge evident in the old man's tone. Jeremiah's weathered hand reached down to stroke Shade's brindled coat, a gesture that seemed to comfort man more than dog. The morning sunlight highlighted the network of lines etched into his face, each representing some story untold, some hardship weathered, some joy briefly embraced before moving on. His hands showed the accumulated marks of a life lived through work and wandering, missing the tip of one finger, scarred across the knuckles, nails worn permanently short by practical necessity rather than grooming preference. "I've been coming to these parts for over 20 years, he said quietly. his voice carrying the slight rasp of someone who had spent many nights around campfires where smoke curled capriciously on shifting winds. Started when the nearest town was just 3 buildings and watering hole where traders and trappers would barter goods. Watched this territory change season by season, year by year. Seen forests cleared for farmland. Seen creeks dammed to create holding ponds. Seen game trails widened into roads that brought more change with each passing wagon. He paused, gaze drifting toward the distant horizon as if watching those transformations replay themselves across his memory. Traveling the same routes, watching the land change as settlements grow and wild places shrink. This bluff has remained constant, one of the few places that seems to hold itself apart from all that progress. He looked up, meeting Thomas's gaze directly. And yes, over time, I've come to know more about what happens here than most. Then tell me, Thomas said, settling onto a boulder opposite the old trader. No tall tales or ghost stories now, just what you know to be true, however strange it might sound. For a long moment, Jeremiah was silent. His gaze turned inward as if determining how much to share and in what manner. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the measured cadence of someone choosing words with great care. This place has always been a crossroads of sorts, he began. Not for ordinary trails. There are no natural routes that converge here, no logical reason for it to serve as meeting point or way station. Yet it has drawn travelers nonetheless, particularly those who journey alone. He gestured toward the fire ring. I believe they came initially for the practical reason that the summit offers visibility in all directions, safety for the solitary rider, concerned about ambush or surprise. Thomas nodded. The tactical advantage was obvious to anyone who had spent time in potentially hostile territory. But over time, Jeremiah continued, it became something more. A tradition among a certain kind of traveler. Those with no fixed destination, no permanent connections. Drifters, wanderers, scouts, messengers. They'd make the difficult climb for no better reason than to follow in the footsteps of those who came before them, to be part of something larger than their solitary journeys. The explanation sounded reasonable enough, though it didn't account for the fire Thomas had witnessed the previous night. And now? He prompted. What happens here now, when settlements have spread and true wilderness grows scarcer each year? Jeremiah's eyes crinkled at the corners, a smile that didn't quite reach his lips. Now the tradition continues, though the travelers have changed in nature. He paused, seeming to weigh his next words. The way I understand it, the way it was explained to me years ago by someone who knew more than I did then, is that certain places develop a kind of memory, an impression left by those who pass through with particular intensity of feeling or purpose. Despite the morning sunshine, Thomas felt a slight chill at the nape of his neck. You're talking about ghosts, aren't you? Not exactly, Jeremiah countered. Not in the way of vengeful spirits or lost souls unable to find rest. Something more deliberate, more purposeful. He gestured broadly at the summit around them. This place became significant to a certain type of person. The lifetime wanderer, the permanent outsider. Those who found more comfort beneath stars than beneath roofs. In life, they discovered this spot and made it momentarily their own. In death, some essential part of them remembers and returns. The explanation should have sounded absurd. A fantasy born of frontier superstition and the human tendency to populate empty places with meaning. Yet Thomas found himself unable to dismiss it entirely, not after what he had heard the previous night. You make it sound almost like a gathering place, he said, a social club for departed drifters. Jeremiah nodded, seeming pleased by the characterization. That's not far wrong, though I'd call it more of a rest stop on a different kind of journey. They come back because this was where they felt a rare sense of belonging among others like themselves. Not family by blood, but by disposition and experience. His expression grew distant. Many who wander alone in life fear dying the same way. Perhaps this gathering is an answer to that fear, a promise that even the most solitary traveler finds companionship, eventually. Thomas's fingers tightened unconsciously around the tin cup he still held, its worn surface suddenly seeming more significant, more personal. And the fire? The one visible from below? A beacon, Jeremiah said simply. A welcome, a sign that says, "Here gather those who understand the road you've traveled," visible only to those who need to see it. The implication hung unspoken between them, that Thomas had seen the fire because he was one of those solitary travelers, one of those who might someday join that ghostly gathering after his own wandering had ceased. The thought should have disturbed him, yet he found in it a strange comfort instead, a promise that the isolation he had both chosen and endured might eventually give way to understanding and acceptance. "The cup," Thomas said finally, holding it up between them. "It's one of theirs?" Jeremiah studied it with interest. "Hard to say. Objects get left behind by various visitors, living or otherwise. Things forgotten or perhaps deliberately placed as markers or offerings." He reached out a weathered hand. "May I?" Thomas handed over the cup, watching as the old trader turned it carefully in the sunlight, examining its plain surface with the attention normally reserved for precious artifacts. After a moment, Jeremiah nodded to himself and returned it. "Keep it," he said with quiet certainty. "It found its way to you for a reason." Under normal circumstances, Thomas might have scoffed at such mystical attribution of purpose to a discarded drinking vessel. Yet nothing about this encounter felt normal. Not the impossible campfire he had witnessed, not the voices carried to him across an impossible distance, not this circle of blackened stones that spoke of countless gatherings that official history would never record. "What happens now?" Thomas asked, carefully tucking the cup into his coat pocket. "Do I just go on my way, carrying one more strange tale to ponder on lonely trails?" Jeremiah rose slowly from his seat, joints creaking with the motion. "That depends entirely on you," he said. "Some who find this place never return, content with a single glimpse behind the veil. Others come back year after year, drawn by what they experienced or hoping to experience more." He offered a hand to help Thomas to his feet, but all leave changed in some fashion, carrying something they didn't have before. As they stood together beside the cold firing, Thomas felt the truth of those words. Something had shifted within him during the night, a loosening of the isolation he had worn like armor for so many years, a recognition that his chosen solitude need not extend beyond this life, that somewhere, somehow, those who walked similar paths awaited with understanding rather than judgment. "I should get back," he said finally, "miles to cover before nightfall." Jeremiah nodded, understanding the wanderer's perpetual pull toward the next horizon. The trail down is easier than the climb up, though it pays to be cautious still. He whistled softly to Shade, who rose immediately to his feet. "We'll be continuing north ourselves. Perhaps our path will cross again someday." Thomas had heard and spoken such pleasantries countless times at countless partings, rarely with any expectation of fulfillment, yet something in Jeremiah's tone suggested more than empty courtesy, a genuine knowledge that their meeting had not been mere chance. Nor would this parting necessarily be permanent. "I'd welcome that," Thomas replied, surprising himself with his sincerity. They descended the treacherous path in single file, Jeremiah leading, with Shade navigating the difficult terrain with casual ease. As the old trader had promised, the journey down proved less arduous than the climb, though it still required careful attention to avoid dangerous missteps on the loose shale and narrow ledges. When they reached the base, Thomas was mildly surprised to find Penny waiting patiently nearby, having apparently broken her tether and wandered to the bluff's western face. The mare showed no signs of having attempted to flee during his absence, another small mystery to add to the larger ones that had unfolded since the previous evening. "Good journey to you, Thomas Everett," Jeremiah said as they prepared to part ways at the base of the bluff. "And remember what I told you about the fire, should you ever find yourself passing this way again. Just sit quiet and listen to the night," Thomas recalled. "No need to approach." The old trader smiled, an expression that momentarily smoothed the deep lines etched into his weathered features. "The invitation comes in its own time," he said cryptically, "not for us to rush or demand." With that enigmatic farewell, Jeremiah and his silent companion set off northward, following some trail visible only to one who had traversed it many times before. Thomas watched until they disappeared among the rolling terrain, then turned to his own preparations for departure. The morning was well advanced now, the sun climbing toward its zenith in a sky of perfect clarity, urging him onward to whatever lay ahead. As he saddled Penny and secured his few possessions, Thomas found his movements accompanied by an unfamiliar lightness, not physical, but something deeper, as if a burden he had carried so long he had forgotten its weight had been partially lifted from his shoulders. The world around him seemed unchanged, the same vast plains, the same distant horizons, the same solitary path stretching before him, yet he himself had been subtly altered, his perception shifted by what he had witnessed and what had been shared with him. With everything secured, Thomas swung into the saddle and guided Penny back toward the main trail, resisting the urge to look back at Stillwater Bluff as it receded behind him. Whatever mystery dwelled there would continue its quiet existence, whether he acknowledged it or not. The phantom fire would appear on certain nights, visible to those who needed its beacon. The ghostly gathering would welcome its own, generation after generation, as long as there were solitary souls who hungered for understanding. And perhaps someday, when his own wandering had reached its end, Thomas Everett might find himself climbing that difficult path one final time, approaching a fire whose warmth he could finally share rather than merely witness from afar. The thought, which should have been melancholy or even frightening, instead filled him with an unexpected peace as he rode onward beneath the endless sky, the tin cup safe in his pocket, a token of connection to something beyond the lonely miles that stretched before him, a promise that even the most solitary journey ultimately led to companionship among those who understood the road traveled. With this newfound comfort riding alongside him, Thomas turned his face toward the northern horizon and whatever it might hold, his path momentarily illuminated by the memory of a fire that burned beyond the boundaries of ordinary existence, a beacon not just for the lost, but for those who had chosen their solitude and might someday choose to set it aside. As Penny's steady gait carried him across the rolling plains, Thomas felt the weight of the tin cup in his pocket, a tangible reminder of what he had witnessed and what awaited. The road ahead remained as uncertain as ever, winding toward destinations unknown and encounters unpredictable. Yet something had fundamentally shifted in his perception of that journey. The solitude that had been both shield and burden now felt more like a temporary condition than permanent sentence, a chapter rather than the entire story. Perhaps tonight he would make camp earlier than usual, taking time to brew coffee in his own battered pot while watching stars emerge in their ancient patterns overhead. Perhaps he would allow himself to remember those he had traveled beside throughout the years, acknowledging their significance rather than burying those connections beneath protective layers of practiced indifference. And perhaps, as the night deepened around him, he would raise his cup in silent salute to distant companions gathered around their own impossible fire, fellow travelers separated by the boundaries of existence, but united by the shared experience of having chosen the horizon's call over hearth and home. For now it was enough to ride beneath the vast sky, feeling the rhythmic movement of his horse beneath him, listening to the whisper of wind through prairie grass, and knowing that somewhere, beyond sight but not beyond understanding, others like himself had found their way to companionship that transcended even death's final horizon. Thomas Everett rode onward, a solitary figure against the landscape's immensity, yet no longer truly alone. As the tale of Thomas Everett and the mysterious campfire atop Stillwater Bluff fades into memory, let us turn our attention to another story from this frontier land. The rolling plains give way to new horizons, and different mysteries await beneath the vast western sky. Just as the weary travelers find their rest around the phantom fire of Stillwater Bluff, so too do other secrets linger in the quiet corners of this untamed country. Our journey continues across the weathered landscape, where the whisper of wind through tall grass carries echoes of experiences yet untold. Turn your thoughts now toward the silhouette of weathered structures standing sentinel against the twilight sky, to the place locals speak of with hushed voices and knowing glances, a place where ancient mechanisms creak and turn with the changing winds, where shadows stretch long across sun-baked earth, and where watchers keep their silent vigil. Join us now as we discover what awaits at Windmill Hill. Pocketing the stone, Thomas prepared to make a dash through the downpour back to town. The school day would begin soon, though he suspected attendance might be reduced given the unseasonable weather. As he stepped out from the shelter of the windmill, he cast one last glance at the spot where he had left his offerings the previous day. The bread was gone, as was the wooden horse. In their place lay a small bundle of dried prairie flowers, bound with what appeared to be horsehair, somehow completely dry despite the surrounding deluge. Thomas crouched and carefully picked up the bundle, tucking it inside his coat to protect it from the rain. Then, with a nod of acknowledgement toward the empty hilltop, he began the slippery descent toward town, his mind whirling with more questions than answers. The rain continued throughout the morning, reducing Thomas's class to half its usual size, as many of the outlying farm children remained home rather than attempting the journey through muddy roads. Those who did attend were restless, with the confined energy of young bodies kept indoors, making the shortened lessons seem paradoxically longer. By midday, Thomas had made the practical decision to dismiss school early, sending his sodden students home with extra reading assignments to compensate for the abbreviated instruction. Left alone in the suddenly quiet schoolhouse, Thomas removed the seeing stone and the bundle of flowers from his coat, placing them on his desk for closer examination. The flowers, now that he could study them properly, included varieties he recognized: prairie coneflower, wild indigo, and what appeared to be Indian paintbrush, though the dried state made positive identification difficult. The horsehair binding was black, woven in an intricate pattern that suggested considerable skill. The stone remained as enigmatic as when he had received it, its red band seeming to shift and pulse when viewed indirectly, becoming ordinary again when subjected to direct scrutiny. A seeing stone, the woman had called it, meant to help him perceive what was already present but not easily observed. Thomas recalled childhood tales of magical objects that granted special vision, the ability to see fairies, detect hidden treasures, or perceive the true nature of disguised beings. Such stories had always been firmly relegated to the realm of fantasy in his educator's mind. Yet recent experiences had left him increasingly open to possibilities that extended beyond conventional explanation. A sudden impulse led him to hold the stone up to his eye, peering through it toward the rain-streaked window. The view through the stone appeared initially unchanged, the same grey sky, the same water-blurred landscape. But as Thomas continued to look, subtle differences emerged. Colors intensified, edges became more defined, and most strikingly, faint luminous trails appeared in the air, like the paths of invisible birds or insects moving through the atmosphere. Lowering the stone, Thomas blinked to reset his vision. The world returned to its ordinary appearance, slightly dull by comparison, lacking the luminous quality he had glimpsed through the stone. He raised it again, this time directing his gaze toward the town's small cemetery, visible on a rise behind the church. Through the stone, the graveyard appeared transformed, not frightening, but alive with gentle movement, as if the air above each grave rippled with a presence that extended beyond the physical markers. A knock at the schoolhouse door startled Thomas so badly that he nearly dropped the stone, fumbling to pocket it before calling, "Come in!" The door opened to reveal Martha Wilson, her grey hair plastered to her head despite the protection of an oilskin coat and wide-brimmed hat. She carried a covered basket that steamed slightly in the cool air of the classroom. "Thought you might appreciate some hot food, Mr. Mercer, with this weather keeping everyone close to home," she said, setting the basket on the nearest student desk. "Wild turkey stew and cornbread, still warm from the oven." "That's extraordinarily kind, Mrs. Wilson," Thomas replied, genuinely touched by the thoughtful gesture. "Please, join me if you have the time. There's certainly enough for two, and I'd welcome the company." Martha considered the offer for a moment before nodding and removing her dripping outer garments, hanging them near the stove to dry. As she arranged their impromptu meal on Thomas's desk, he noticed her gaze lingering on the bundle of dried flowers he had forgotten to conceal. "I see you've made some friends at the windmill," she commented, her tone casual but her eyes sharp with interest. Thomas saw little point in denial or evasion. "I'm not entirely sure friends is the right word, but yes, there have been exchanges." He hesitated before adding, "I met a woman there this morning, during the worst of the rain. She gave me what she called a seeing stone." Martha's hand stilled in the act of serving stew into two bowls. "Describe her," she said, her voice suddenly intent. Thomas provided as detailed a description as he could, from the simple dress to the unusual amber eyes. As he spoke, Martha's expression shifted from cautious interest to something approaching wonder. "That would be Sarah Blackwood," she said when he had finished. "Though you couldn't have met her, Mr. Mercer, as she died in 1882. Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with his damp clothing. "That's not possible. She was as solid as you or I, spoke clearly, handed me the stone directly." Martha resumed serving their meal, her practical movements at odds with the extraordinary conversation. Sarah was half Lakota, daughter of one of the original settlers and a native woman who died in childbirth. She served as a kind of unofficial doctor for the community, knew more about healing plants than anyone for 100 miles. During a scarlet fever outbreak, she nursed half the town back to health before succumbing herself. She passed Thomas a bowl of stew and a thick slice of cornbread before continuing. "She's buried up in the cemetery behind the church, simple marker with a carving of a horse on it. Her father was a cavalryman who carved her that little wooden horse you found." They ate in silence for several minutes, The only sounds, the drumming of rain on the schoolhouse roof and the occasional rumble of distant thunder. Thomas's mind worked furiously to reconcile Martha's matter-of-fact account with his very tangible experience that morning. "The Watchers," he finally said. "The sheriff told me about 3 riders he saw during the trouble in 78. Are they also—" He couldn't quite bring himself to use the word dead or ghosts, both seeming inadequate for the dignified presences he had encountered. "Those who watch over this place come from different times, different peoples," Marta replied, breaking her cornbread into small pieces. "Some walked these lands long before any of our kind arrived. Others lived and died here more recently. All of them chose to remain, to guard what they valued in life. But why can some people see them while others cannot? And why would they reveal themselves to me, a relative newcomer?" Martha studied him thoughtfully before responding. "Some folks are more open to seeing what others miss, Mr. Mercer. Children often have the gift naturally. They haven't yet learned to dismiss what doesn't fit their understanding of how the world works. Others develop the ability through loss or love, or simply a willingness to acknowledge mystery." She smiled slightly. "As for why they've chosen to reveal themselves to you specifically, that's a question only they can answer. But I will say that this town has been without a proper teacher to remember and pass on its stories for too long. Perhaps they recognize a keeper of knowledge when they see one." Thomas absently touched the pocket containing the seeing stone, recalling the mysterious woman's, Sarah Blackwood's, words about helping the town remember what it had forgotten. "The stone she gave me, when I look through it, I see things differently. Colors, movements in the air, presences around the graveyard." Martha nodded as if this were perfectly reasonable. "Old magic, as she likely told you. There are still places in this world where the boundaries between different kinds of existence grow thin. This region has always been one of them. The native peoples knew it, built their ceremonies around it. When settlers came, some recognized it too, though most preferred to ignore what didn't align with their understanding. She gathered their empty bowls, returning them to the basket with efficient movements. That stone is a gift of trust, Mr. Mercer. What you choose to do with it, whether to look deeper or to set it aside as a curious souvenir, will determine much about your future here." As Martha prepared to depart, donning her still damp outerwear, she paused at the door. "The flowers they gave you, those are healing plants. Dry them properly and keep them. Prairie winters bring coughs that those will help soothe. Sarah would have meant them as both gift and instruction. The Watchers communicate through such gestures more than words." With that, she pulled her hat low and stepped out into the rain, leaving Thomas alone with his thoughts and the tangible evidence of encounters that defied conventional explanation. He remained at his desk long after she had gone, periodically lifting the seeing stone to his eye and observing the transformed world it revealed. The shimmer of energy around living plants, the luminous trails that connected seemingly separate objects, the gentle presence of what he now understood were those who remained to watch over what they had loved. By late afternoon, the rain had diminished to a gentle patter, and a diffuse golden light indicated the sun was breaking through the clouds somewhere above. Thomas carefully packed the dried flowers and seeing stone into his satchel and locked the schoolhouse behind him. Rather than turning toward his lodgings, however, he found himself drawn toward the small cemetery behind the church. The graveyard was modest, perhaps 30 markers in all, ranging from elaborate carved headstones for the town's more prosperous citizens to simple wooden crosses for those of humbler means. Thomas moved slowly among them, reading names and dates, absorbing the community's history through its losses. Epidemic years that claimed multiple citizens within weeks of each other, children taken too young, pioneers who had lived long enough to see the wilderness they had settled transform into an established community. Near the cemetery's northern edge, he found what he was looking for, a simple stone marker bearing the name Sarah Blackwood and the dates 18541882. As Martha had described, a small horse had been carved into the stone below the name, the craftsmanship similar to the wooden figure Thomas had found at the windmill. Despite the recent rain, the area around the grave appeared surprisingly well maintained, with no weeds encroaching on the stone, and what looked like relatively fresh wildflowers placed at its base. Thomas knelt beside the grave, running his fingers over the carved horse. After a moment's hesitation, he withdrew the seeing stone from his pocket and held it to his eye, directing his gaze at the simple marker. Through the stone, the grave appeared suffused with a gentle amber light that rose like mist from the ground, the same shade as Sarah's unusual eyes. The light moved in currents reminiscent of wind through prairie grass, extending upward before dissipating into the surrounding atmosphere. Lowering the stone, Thomas remained kneeling beside the grave. "I don't fully understand what's happening," he said quietly, feeling only slightly self-conscious about speaking aloud in the empty cemetery. "But I'm willing to learn, to see what you want to show me." A sudden breeze swept through the graveyard, carrying with it the scent of prairie wildflowers despite the season and recent rain. Thomas felt it ruffle his hair in what almost seemed a caress before continuing on toward town, sending raindrops scattering from the church's eaves like tiny diamonds catching the emerging sunlight. As he walked back toward his lodgings, Thomas found himself viewing the town with new awareness. Through the seeing stone, held occasionally to his eye, Coote's Chapel revealed itself as more than just a collection of buildings and inhabitants. It was a tapestry of connections, visible energy flowing between people, structures, and the surrounding landscape, all of it watched over by presences that most citizens never consciously perceived. Near the general store, he observed Emma Wilson showing something to two younger children, their faces alight with interest. Curious, Thomas approached, joining their small circle without interrupting. Emma held a sheet of drawing paper on which she had created a surprisingly skilled rendering of the windmill at dawn, with 3 indistinct figures seated at its base, and a fourth standing slightly apart, a woman in a simple dress. "That's a remarkable drawing, Emma," Thomas commented, genuinely impressed by both the technical skill and the subject matter. "Where did you see this scene?" Emma looked up, seemingly unsurprised by his interest. "In my dream last night, Mr. Mercer. Grandma says I have true dreaming sometimes, like she did when she was young." She pointed to the female figure. "She told me to show you this and say that there's going to be a gathering at the windmill on Sunday at dawn. She said to bring your stone and that you'd understand." The other children nodded solemnly, apparently finding nothing unusual about either the drawing or the message it conveyed. Thomas thanked Emma for sharing the information and continued toward home, his world expanding and realigning with each step. Sunday dawned clear and cool, the recent rains having washed the landscape to a pristine brightness that made every detail stand out in sharp relief. Thomas had risen well before first light, dressing with unusual care before setting out toward Windmill Hill. In his pocket, the seeing stone seemed to pulse with warmth, as if anticipating the gathering Emma's drawing had foretold. As he crested the hill, Thomas was surprised to find he was not the first to arrive. Martha Wilson stood near the base of the windmill, straight-backed despite her years, wearing her Sunday best, though the church service would not begin for hours yet. Beside her stood Sheriff Davis, Looking uncomfortable in a clean shirt and string tie, his ever-present sidearm incongruous against the formal attire. Emma Wilson sat cross-legged in the grass nearby, sketch pad open on her lap, pencil moving in swift, sure strokes across the page. "Good morning," Thomas greeted them, curiosity evident in his tone. "I didn't expect company." "Invitation works differently for different people," Martha replied cryptically. "Some dream it, some feel it as a pull they can't explain, some receive more direct communication." Sheriff Davis cleared his throat awkwardly. "Got a letter, if you can believe it. Slid under my door Friday night, though nobody saw who delivered it. Said to be here at dawn, that it concerned the safety of the town." He adjusted his collar nervously. "Probably wouldn't have come except, well, given recent events, seemed prudent to at least check." Recent events, Thomas knew, referred to rumors of a new outlaw gang operating in territories to the north, gradually moving southward with increasing boldness. Nothing had been confirmed, but telegraph reports from other settlements had the town on edge, particularly the sheriff, who remembered all too well the devastation of the previous attack decades earlier. Before Thomas could inquire further, Emma's pencil stilled, and she looked up toward the eastern horizon with an expression of anticipation. Following her gaze, Thomas saw the first edge of the sun appearing, sending long rays of golden light across the prairie grass that rippled like a vast ocean in the morning breeze. "It's time," Martha said quietly, her voice carrying in the stillness. "Thomas, you'll want to use your stone now." Thomas withdrew the seeing stone from his pocket, noting that the red band glowed more vividly than he had ever seen it, pulsing with an inner light that matched the rhythm of his heartbeat. Raising it to his eye, he turned in a slow circle, observing their surroundings through its transformative lens. The change was immediate and profound. Where the hilltop had appeared empty save for their small group, it now teemed with presence. Dozens of figures stood in a wide circle around the windmill, men and women of various ages and origins, some in clothing Thomas recognized from historical engravings of early settlers, others in the traditional garb of native peoples who had inhabited the region long before European arrival. Among them, he recognized the 3 watchers he had first encountered, their serapes now vivid with color rather than the faded earth tones he had previously perceived. Standing slightly apart was Sarah Blackwood, her simple dress now revealed as a deep blue, adorned with intricate beadwork at collar and cuffs, her dark hair woven with small flowers. "There are so many of them," Thomas breathed, turning slowly to take in the full assembly, from different times, different peoples. "The Watchers have always been here," Martha replied, her voice steady though her eyes glistened with emotion. "Those who loved this land enough to remain, to protect what comes after them. My Henry is among them, though my eyes are too old now to see him clearly without help." Thomas automatically offered her the seeing stone, but Martha shook her head with a gentle smile. "I've had my time of seeing, Mr. Mercer. Now it's yours." Sheriff Davis shifted uncomfortably beside them. "What exactly is happening here?" he asked, his hand unconsciously moving closer to his sidearm as if seeking reassurance from the familiar weight. "A council," Emma replied before either adult could speak, her young voice certain. "They gather when danger approaches the town. See how they form a circle? They're deciding how to protect us." Through the stone, Thomas watched as the assembled watchers turned as one to face inward, creating a perfect circle with the windmill at its center. A low sound began, not quite singing or chanting, but something between the two, in a language, or perhaps multiple languages, that Thomas did not recognize, yet found strangely comprehensible on some level beyond conscious understanding. It spoke of protection, of boundaries maintained and threats diverted, of a love for the land and its people that transcended the ordinary limitations of death and time. In the center of the circle, directly beneath the steadily turning windmill, a shimmering began, a gathering of light that coalesced into a map-like image hovering in mid-air. Thomas recognized the regional geography. Coots Chapel at the center, surrounding territories extending outward in all directions. Moving along one of the northern trails was a cluster of red points, like drops of blood against the golden landscape. "The Clayton gang," Sheriff Davis murmured, his skepticism momentarily forgotten as he leaned forward to study the hovering image. 7 or 8 of them, moving this way just as the telegraph reports indicated. The chanting intensified, and Thomas watched through the stone as several of the watchers stepped into the circle. A native man with symbols painted on his face and chest, a cavalry officer with a distinctive scar running along his jawline, and Sarah Blackwood, her expression serene but determined. They conferred silently, gestures indicating routes and positions on the floating map, strategy forming through a communication that required no words. After what seemed both moments and hours, a decision appeared to be reached. The watchers returned to their positions in the circle, and the chanting changed tenor, becoming more focused, more directed. The shimmering map responded, luminous trails appearing from multiple directions, converging on the red cluster representing the approaching outlaws. "They're sending some of their number to intercept," Martha explained softly to Thomas, "to turn the danger away from our doorstep before it arrives." As if in confirmation, 3 riders separated from the circle and mounted horses that had not been visible moments before. Magnificent animals that seemed formed of prairie mist and dawn light. Thomas recognized them as the original watchers he had first seen beneath the windmill, their forms now more distinct, their purpose clear as they waited at the edge of the assembly. The chanting reached a crescendo, and, as one, the gathered watchers raised their hands toward the mounted trio, a visible current of energy flowing from the circle to the riders. Then, with a sound like wind through dry grass, the 3 spurred their ethereal mounts and rode northward, their forms dissolving into the landscape even as Thomas watched through the stone. As suddenly as it had begun, the ceremony concluded. The chanting faded, the glowing map dissipated, and the watchers began to disperse, some fading from view entirely while others moved in smaller groups away from the windmill. Only Sarah remained, approaching their small gathering of living observers with that same serene expression Thomas had noted earlier. Through the stone, he could see her clearly now, not as a ghost or insubstantial spirit, but as a woman of flesh and blood who simply existed in a different relationship to time and physicality than he did. She stopped before them, her gaze moving from face to face with warm recognition, lingering longest on Emma, whose pencil had never ceased its movement, recording the scene with remarkable accuracy despite her youth. "It is done," Sarah said, her voice carrying easily despite its softness. "The danger will be turned aside. Not all of those who threaten will survive the encounter, but no harm will come to Coots Chapel or its people." Sheriff Davis straightened, finding his official voice despite the extraordinary circumstances. "Ma'am, I don't pretend to understand what I've witnessed here, but if you're saying the Clayton gang won't reach our town, I'd be obliged to know how you can be certain." Sarah smiled, the expression transforming her solemn features with unexpected warmth. "Because the Watchers have chosen to intervene, Sheriff, as they have done many times before, though few have been granted the vision to perceive it." She turned to Thomas. "Which is why your presence here matters greatly. What is not remembered is eventually lost. Someone must keep the knowledge, tell the stories, help others see what most overlook." "The school teacher," Martha murmured. Just as Henry did in his time. Sarah nodded. The stone you carry is rare, Mr. Mercer, but the ability to see beyond ordinary appearances exists in anyone willing to look with patience and openness. Teaching that perception, especially to the young, she gestured toward Emma, who beamed at the acknowledgement, ensures that the connection between watchers and watched continues for generations to come. She reached out, her fingers brushing Thomas's hand where he still held the seeing stone. The touch felt cool yet vital, like water from a deep spring. You have questions still. That is good. Questions keep perception alive, prevent knowledge from hardening into rigid belief. Return to the windmill when you seek answers. Not all will be provided, but those you need most will find you. With that, she stepped back, her form beginning to fade into the increasing daylight. Before she disappeared completely, Sarah turned to Emma with a final smile. Your grandmother's vision passes to you now, child. Use it wisely. Then, like morning mist burned away by strengthening sun, she was gone, leaving only the creaking windmill and waving prairie grass as evidence that anything unusual had occurred on the hilltop. The four of them stood in silence for several moments, each processing what they had witnessed according to their own framework of understanding. Finally, Sheriff Davis cleared his throat, adjusting his hat with a gesture that seemed to help him realign with more familiar reality. Well, he said, his voice gruff but not unkind, I should get back to town. Early church service this morning. He tipped his hat to Martha and Emma, nodded to Thomas, and started down the hill with the measured stride of a man carefully rebuilding his ordinary world with each step. Martha watched him go with knowing amusement. He'll never speak of this directly, she observed, but the next time he rides patrol near the windmill, he'll leave tobacco as an offering. His grandfather was Comanche. He remembers more than he admits about the old ways. Emma had finished her drawing and now held it up for their inspection. A remarkably detailed rendering of the Watcher's Circle, the shimmering map, and the three riders preparing to depart on their protective mission. Though created with only pencil, the image somehow conveyed both movement and the multidimensional quality of what they had witnessed. This should be preserved, Thomas said, recognizing the historical and cultural significance of the record. Would you allow me to keep it in the school archives, Emma? With full credit to you as the artist, of course. The girl nodded solemnly, carefully tearing the page from her sketchbook and handing it to him. Grandma says there should always be at least two who remember each important thing. That way, if something happens to one, the knowledge isn't lost. Wise advice, Thomas agreed, carefully placing the drawing in his satchel alongside the seeing stone, which had returned to its more ordinary appearance, though the red band still caught the light with unusual vividness. As they began their descent from the hill, Thomas found himself looking back at the windmill, still turning steadily in the morning breeze. Through ordinary vision, it appeared exactly as it always had. Weathered wood against open sky, a practical structure outliving its practical purpose. Yet he now understood it marked something far more significant, a boundary not just between town and wilderness, but between different orders of existence that flowed into and through each other like tributaries of the same vast river. The role he had been offered: to perceive, to remember, to teach others to see beyond surface appearances, seemed both daunting and strangely fitting. He had come to Coote's Chapel seeking something he couldn't articulate, driven by restlessness that no previous position had satisfied. Now, standing between worlds, Thomas Mercer felt that restlessness finally stilling, replaced by a sense of purpose as steady and enduring as the ancient windmill that kept its patient watch over all that was, all that had been, and all that might yet come to pass. Dawn broke over the rolling plains of New Austin with unhurried grace, painting the vast sky in watercolor shades of amber and rose. The tall prairie grasses, still heavy with morning dew, swayed gently in the perpetual breeze that seemed to be the land's own quiet breathing. Upon a modest knoll that rose from the surrounding flatlands stood a weathered windmill, its wooden blades turning in slow, methodical circles, despite years of disuse. The structure had once drawn water for the nearby settlement of Cootes Chapel, but newer wells and modern pumps had rendered it obsolete. Still, it turned faithfully, marking time for a forgotten corner of the frontier. Thomas Mercer adjusted his spectacles as he climbed the gentle slope toward the windmill, his leather satchel hanging heavy with unmarked student essays across his shoulder. 6 months had passed since he'd accepted the position as school teacher in the small community, and in that time he had established a routine of early morning walks before the demands of the schoolhouse claimed his attention. There was something about the quality of light at dawn, soft yet clarifying, that helped organize his thoughts for the day ahead. The windmill had become his destination of choice, its steady creaking offering a metronome to pace his reflections. At 42, Thomas carried himself with the slight stoop of a man who had spent most of his life bent over books. His once dark hair had begun retreating from his forehead and was flecked with grey at the temples, giving him a distinguished appearance that commanded respect from both students and their parents. Though not a physically imposing man, his voice carried natural authority, honed through years of maintaining order in classrooms from Saint-Denis to the smaller townships that dotted the expanding frontier. He had nearly reached the crest of the hill when he noticed something unusual. A figure seated at the base of the windmill, silhouetted against the brightening sky. The person appeared to be watching the sunrise, motionless as the tall grasses waved around them. Thomas hesitated, reluctant to intrude upon someone else's solitude. Deciding to be neighborly nonetheless, he raised his hand in greeting and continued his approach. But when he looked again after a moment of navigating a particularly dense patch of scrub brush, the figure had vanished. Thomas blinked, scanning the hilltop and surrounding slopes with confusion. There was nowhere the person could have gone so quickly without being seen. The nearest trees or buildings were too distant to reach in the seconds he had looked away. Yet the hilltop was undeniably empty now, with only the creaking windmill disturbing the morning stillness. He increased his pace, climbing to the spot where he had seen the seated figure. At the base of the windmill, the grass appeared slightly flattened, as if someone had indeed been sitting there. Thomas knelt, running his fingers over the compressed blades. The dew still clung to them, undisturbed by the passage of feet. Standing again, he turned a slow circle, surveying the vast open country that stretched in all directions. His gaze caught on something half hidden in the grass. A small carved wooden horse, no bigger than his thumb, weathered and smooth as if handled for many years. He picked it up, turning it over in his palm. The craftsmanship was remarkable for such a tiny object, the flowing mane and alert ears rendered with obvious care. "Hello," he called out, his voice carried away by the gentle wind. "Did you lose something?" Only the creaking of the windmill answered him. After a moment's hesitation, Thomas pocketed the wooden horse and settled in the spot where the figure had been sitting. From this vantage point, he could see the scattered buildings of Cootes Chapel beginning to stir with morning activity. Smoke rising from chimneys, a few early risers moving between buildings with purposeful strides. Beyond the settlement, the endless prairie stretched toward distant mesas, their layered facades glowing red-gold in the early light. The view was undeniably beautiful, but Thomas found himself distracted by the mystery of the vanished figure and the tiny wooden horse. He had heard no local stories about the windmill being a meeting place or having any particular significance beyond its practical purpose. Perhaps it had simply been another early riser seeking solitude who had departed quickly upon seeing someone else approaching their sanctuary. With a sigh, Thomas opened his satchel and withdrew a stack of arithmetic assignments, determined to make productive use of his remaining time before school began. Yet as he marked the first paper, he found his gaze repeatedly drawn to the horizon, as if expecting the mysterious figure to reappear. There was something about the quality of the solitude here, not lonely, but watchful, that made the hair on the back of his neck rise slightly, not with fear, but with an inexplicable sense that despite appearances, he was not alone on the hilltop. The sun had fully crested the horizon by the time Thomas gathered his papers and began the walk back to town. The settlement had come fully awake now, with children running between buildings and horses being led from stables. The normality of the scene reassured him, grounding the strange morning encounter in the practicalities of the day ahead. Still, as he cast one last look over his shoulder at the windmill, he found himself already planning to return the following morning. Throughout the school day, Thomas found his thoughts drifting back to the solitary figure and the tiny wooden horse that now rested in his vest pocket. His distraction did not go unnoticed by his students, particularly Emma Wilson, a precocious 12-year-old with observational skills that often surpassed those of adults in the community. "Mr. Mercer," she asked as they worked on geography lessons, "have you seen the watchers up at the old windmill?" Thomas nearly dropped his chalk. "The watchers? What do you mean, Emma?" The girl shrugged, her blonde braids bouncing with the movement. "That's what my grandma calls them. She says they sit up there sometimes, watching over the town. Nobody really sees them except early in the morning or when the sun's going down." Before Thomas could inquire further, William McCreary, the blacksmith's son, chimed in. "My pa says that's just stories for babies. There's nobody up there but maybe coyotes or rabbits." "It's not stories," Emma insisted, her cheeks flushing with conviction. "Grandma leaves bread for them sometimes, and it's always gone by morning." "That's just because animals eat it," William scoffed. Thomas cleared his throat, regaining control of the classroom. "That's enough, children. Let's return to our lesson about the mountain ranges to the west." He turned back to the chalkboard, but not before making a mental note to speak with Emma's grandmother at the earliest opportunity. That chance came sooner than expected when school dismissed for the day. Martha Wilson, Emma's grandmother, stood waiting outside the schoolhouse, her gnarled hands resting on a walking stick worn smooth by years of use. Despite her 80 years, she stood straight-backed and clear-eyed, a fixture in the community known for both her sharp tongue and generous spirit. "Mrs. Wilson," Thomas greeted her, tipping his hat respectfully. "What a pleasure to see you this afternoon." "Spare me the pleasantries, Mr. Mercer," she replied with a directness that had become her hallmark. "Emma tells me you were asking about the windmill this morning." Thomas blinked in surprise. "Actually, she volunteered the information about watchers, I believe she called them." Martha's eyes narrowed slightly as she studied his face. "And what's your interest in such matters, school teacher?" Thomas hesitated, unsure how much to reveal about his morning experience. "I often walk to the windmill before school. It's peaceful there. This morning I thought I saw someone sitting beneath it, but when I looked again, they were gone." Something in Martha's expression shifted, a momentary softening that vanished almost as quickly as it appeared. "Walk with me, Mr. Mercer. My old bones don't move as quickly as they once did, but I can still manage the distance to my home." They set off together down the dusty main street, Martha's walking stick tapping a steady rhythm against the packed earth. For several minutes they walked in silence, passing the general store, the small church, and the saloon that served as both drinking establishment and informal town hall. The windmill was built by my husband's father in '64, Martha finally said. Helped this settlement survive the drought of '67, when wells across the territory ran dry. Before that, the hill was already special to the native folks who passed through these parts. They called it the watching place, in their language. Thomas listened intently, fascinated by this glimpse into local history that hadn't appeared in any of the town records he'd studied since his arrival. What were they watching for? Martha gave a small, enigmatic smile. Not what, Mr. Mercer. Who? The old ones believed certain places allowed crossing between worlds, where the living could glimpse those who had passed on, and where the departed could keep watch over those they'd left behind. You're speaking of ghosts, Thomas said carefully, conscious of not wanting to sound dismissive. I'm speaking of watchers, Martha corrected him. Not all who linger are lost or troubled souls, Mr. Mercer. Some simply continue their life's purpose from beyond the veil. They had reached Martha's small house at the eastern edge of town, its whitewashed walls and carefully tended garden standing in contrast to the more utilitarian buildings that comprised most of the settlement. A porch swing moved gently in the breeze, though no one sat upon it. My Henry passed 15 years ago come October, Martha said, pausing at her gate. Epidemic took him and 20 others in a single week. He was the town's first proper school teacher, you know. Before the schoolhouse was built, he taught children right there on our porch. She nodded toward the swing. Some mornings I look out and could swear I see him sitting there still, watching over the children as they walk to school. Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mild spring air. Mrs. Wilson, are you suggesting that what I saw at the windmill... I'm not suggesting anything, Mr. Mercer, she interrupted. Just sharing a bit of local history with our new school teacher. What you believe about what you saw is entirely your own business. She opened her gate, but paused before entering. Though I will say this, if you're inclined to return to the windmill at dawn, you might consider bringing something to share. Bread works well. They seem to appreciate the gesture. With that cryptic advice, she entered her garden and closed the gate behind her, leaving Thomas standing in the street with more questions than answers. The tiny wooden horse seemed to weigh heavier in his pocket as he turned toward his own modest lodgings above the town's small library. That evening, as Thomas prepared his lessons for the following day, he found himself repeatedly distracted by Martha Wilson's words and the memory of the figure at the windmill. Outside his window, the settlement gradually quieted as night descended. Lights in windows extinguished one by one until only the saloon remained illuminated, the faint sounds of a piano and occasional laughter drifting up to his rooms. On impulse, he took out the wooden horse and placed it on his desk, studying it in the lamplight. The carving showed signs of considerable age. The wood had darkened with time and handling, its edges softened to a buttery smoothness. Yet the detail remained remarkable, from the alert ears to the flowing tail. It had been created by someone with both skill and affection for their craft. Thomas opened his desk drawer and removed a small piece of bread he had saved from his evening meal, wrapped in a handkerchief. He felt slightly foolish as he did so, a man of education and rational thought preparing an offering based on local superstition. Yet something about Martha Wilson's matter-of-fact delivery made her suggestions difficult to dismiss entirely. At the very least, he reasoned, returning to the windmill with bread would do no harm, and it might provide an opportunity to return the wooden horse to its rightful owner should they appear again. Setting his alarm clock for an hour earlier than usual, Thomas completed his lesson preparations and retired to bed, his dreams filled with turning windmills and silent figures watching from distant hillsides. The following morning arrived with a pearl-grey light that preceded true dawn, the world rendered in muted tones as if sketched with a soft pencil. Thomas dressed quickly against the pre-dawn chill and wrapped the piece of bread in fresh paper before slipping the wooden horse into his pocket. Outside, the town slept still, only the occasional rooster announcing the approaching day as he made his way through empty streets toward the open prairie beyond. The windmill appeared on the horizon as a dark silhouette against the gradually lightening sky, its blades turning in their steady rhythm. As Thomas approached the hill, he found himself moving more cautiously than the previous day, scanning the hilltop for any sign of another visitor. From a distance, the area appeared empty, but he had learned not to trust first impressions where the windmill was concerned. He had nearly reached the crest when he saw them, not one figure this time, but three, seated in a semicircle at the base of the windmill. They appeared to be wearing long coats or blankets draped around their shoulders, their features indistinct in the dim light. Thomas slowed his pace, heart quickening despite his determination to remain rational. Unlike the previous day, the figures showed no sign of vanishing as he approached, remaining motionless as if in deep contemplation of the horizon. At 30 paces away, he cleared his throat. "Good morning," he called, his voice sounding unnaturally loud in the pre-dawn stillness. The figures made no response, no indication that they had heard him or were even aware of his presence. Thomas hesitated, then continued his approach with deliberate steps, making no effort to move quietly. Still, the seated forms remained immobile, their attention fixed on the eastern horizon, where the first sliver of sun would soon appear. At 10 paces, Thomas stopped, close enough now to make out more details. What he had taken for coats appeared to be serapes, or blankets worn in the style of the region's native peoples. Their once bright patterns faded to the colors of the earth, dusty browns, sun-bleached reds, and the pale yellow of dried grass. Their faces remained in shadow beneath wide-brimmed hats or perhaps hooded coverings. Most disquietingly, they cast no shadows on the ground around them despite the growing light. "Excuse me," Thomas said, his voice steadier than he expected. "I believe I found something that might belong to one of you." He withdrew the wooden horse from his pocket, holding it out toward the silent group. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, the figure on the far right turned its head slightly toward him. Thomas caught a glimpse of a profile beneath the shadow of a hat, the strong nose and high cheekbone of a man who had spent his life under open skies. The figure made no move to take the offered carving, but a sudden gust of wind swept around Thomas, tugging at his clothes and nearly pulling the tiny horse from his palm. Instinctively, he closed his fingers around it, protecting it from being blown away. When he looked up again, all three figures had turned to face him, their features still obscured, but their attention unmistakably focused on him now. The feeling that swept over Thomas was not fear, precisely, but a profound awareness of being truly seen. Not just his physical presence, but something deeper, as if these silent watchers could perceive the entirety of who he was in a single, comprehensive gaze. The moment stretched, measured only by the steady creaking of the windmill above them and the quickened pace of Thomas's breathing. Then, as one, the figures turned back toward the east, where the upper curve of the sun had just breached the horizon. The quality of light changed dramatically, golden rays spearing across the prairie and illuminating the hilltop in brilliant clarity. Thomas blinked against the sudden brightness, raising his hand to shade his eyes. When his vision adjusted seconds later, the three figures were gone. He stood alone on the hilltop, the wooden horse clutched in his hand, and a profound silence surrounding him, broken only by the eternal turning of the windmill. Moving forward on unsteady legs, Thomas approached the spot where the watchers had been seated. The grass showed no sign of compression, no evidence that anyone had been there at all. Yet in the center of where their semicircle had been, a small, smooth stone now lay, pale grey with a single band of red running through its center. Thomas knelt and picked it up, finding it warm to the touch despite the cool morning air, as if it had been carried close to someone's body for a long time. Almost without thinking, he placed the wooden horse beside the stone and then, remembering Martha's advice, set the wrapped bread alongside these offerings. He straightened and took a step back, unsure what to expect, but feeling that some exchange had been initiated, some acknowledgement made. For several minutes, Thomas simply stood, watching the items lying in the grass, half expecting them to vanish before his eyes. When nothing happened, he finally seated himself, a respectful distance away, his back against one of the windmill's sturdy legs. From this position, he could see both his offerings and the panoramic view that had seemingly held the watcher's attention. The town beginning to stir below, the vast prairie stretching to distant mesas, all of it bathed in the golden light of early morning. There was something profoundly peaceful about the scene, a sense of rightness that Thomas hadn't experienced in a very long time. His life as an educator had always been fulfilling in an intellectual sense, but it had also been marked by a restlessness that had driven him from larger cities to progressively smaller communities, searching for something he couldn't quite articulate. Sitting on the hillside, watching the world awaken beneath the shelter of the turning windmill, he felt an unfamiliar contentment settle over him, as if he had finally stopped long enough to be found by whatever he had been seeking. When the distant church bell rang the hour, Thomas reluctantly gathered himself to leave, knowing his students would be arriving at the schoolhouse soon. As he stood, he cast one last look at his offerings. The bread, stone, and wooden horse remained where he had placed them, undisturbed by wind or wildlife. With a slight bow that felt appropriate somehow, he turned and began his descent from the hill, his mind already composing how he might share this experience with Martha Wilson without sounding like a man who had lost his grip on reality. Throughout the school day, Thomas found himself more present and engaged than he had been in months. The children responded to his focused attention with increased enthusiasm for their lessons, even William McCreary volunteering answers during the history discussion. When Emma Wilson lingered after class, her expression hopeful as she asked if he had seen anything interesting on his morning walk, Thomas merely smiled and suggested she ask her grandmother about the windmill's history. The knowing look she gave him in return suggested that some knowledge passed freely between generations, without need for explicit confirmation. That evening, as Thomas walked home from the schoolhouse, he was surprised to find Sheriff Davis falling into step beside him. The lawman was a taciturn figure, more inclined to action than conversation, which made his deliberate approach unusual enough to raise Thomas's curiosity. "Evening, Thomas," the sheriff greeted him, tipping his hat slightly. "Hear you've been walking up to old Windmill Hill in the mornings." Thomas wondered briefly how the sheriff had come by this information, but reminded himself that little remained private for long in a community of this size. "It's a pleasant spot to gather my thoughts before the school day begins," he confirmed. Sheriff Davis nodded, his expression giving nothing away. "Noticed anything unusual up there?" The direct question caught Thomas off guard. He hesitated, uncertain how much to share or how the sheriff might react to tales of vanishing figures and mysterious exchanges of objects. "It's very peaceful," he said carefully, "though I admit I've become curious about the hill's history. Mrs. Wilson mentioned it was considered special by the native peoples who passed through the area. Martha's got stories about most every rock and tree in the county," the sheriff replied with a slight smile that quickly faded. But that hill, it does have a history. He cleared his throat, seeming uncharacteristically uncomfortable. Back in 78, before your time here, we had some trouble with a gang that had been terrorizing settlements across the territory. They hit Coots Chapel hard, killed 3 men, including our previous schoolteacher, fellow named Henry Preston. Martha Wilson's husband, Thomas murmured, the pieces beginning to connect in his mind. Sheriff Davis looked surprised. That's right. Anyway, the gang was planning to come back and finish clearing out what little valuables the town had left. We got word and tried to organize some defense, but we were outgunned and outmanned. Morning they were supposed to return. I rode up to Windmill Hill to keep watch, hoping to at least give the town some warning when they appeared. He paused, his gaze distant with memory, but they never came. Later found out they'd all been killed crossing Hannigan's Stead. Every last one shot with precision from a distance. Military-grade shooting folks said, though there wasn't an army patrol within 100 miles. Thomas felt a chill run along his spine. What happened? The sheriff shrugged. Official reports said they must have fallen out among themselves. Stranger things have happened with those outlaw types. But, he hesitated, lowering his voice slightly, though no one else walked nearby. I was up on that hill all morning. Just before dawn, I saw 3 riders approach the windmill. Thought they might be scouts for the gang, so I took cover and watched. They just sat there for the longest time, facing east like they were waiting for the sun. When it came up, they rode off toward Hennigan's Stead. Never saw their faces clear, but one of them carried a cavalry carbine like the ones used in the war. They had reached the fork in the road where their paths would separate, the sheriff continuing to his office, Thomas to his lodgings above the library. Both men paused, the weight of the unfinished story hanging between them. I'm not saying I believe in ghost stories, Mr. Mercer, Sheriff Davis finally continued, his voice pitched low. But I do know that every few years since then, when trouble's brewing for this town, folks report seeing watchers up at that windmill. And somehow, the trouble always gets resolved before it reaches us. He cleared his throat again. Just thought you should know, if you're making a habit of those morning walks. Some things don't take kindly to being observed too closely. With a touch to the brim of his hat, the sheriff continued on his way, leaving Thomas standing at the crossroads, with yet another layer added to the mystery of Windmill Hill. The wooden horse and red-banded stone now seemed heavier in his pocket as he turned toward home, his mind working to reconcile rational explanation with the increasingly difficult to dismiss suggestion that something truly extraordinary occurred at the old windmill. The following morning dawned with heavy clouds that promised rain, unusual for the season. Thomas hesitated at his window, watching lightning flicker on the distant horizon. Prudence suggested remaining indoors until the weather cleared, but something stronger than curiosity drew him toward his coat and hat. The bread he had left the previous day would be soaked if rain came before he could check on it, and there was the matter of the stone and wooden horse, whether they remained or had been claimed in his absence. By the time he reached the edge of town, the first fat droplets were beginning to fall, raising small puffs of dust from the dry earth before dampening it to a darker hue. The windmill stood starkly against the leaden sky, its blades turning with increased vigor in the strengthening wind. Thomas quickened his pace, determined to reach the shelter of the structure before the rain fell in earnest. He was halfway up the slope when the shower became a downpour, water streaming from the brim of his hat and soaking through his coat despite his efforts to secure it around himself. By the time he reached the windmill, Thomas was thoroughly drenched, his spectacles fogged and streaming with moisture. Seeking shelter on the leeward side of the windmill's base, he removed his glasses to clean them, the world reduced to indistinct shapes and colors without their aid. As he wiped the lenses on a relatively dry portion of his handkerchief, he became aware that he was not alone. A figure stood nearby, tall and solid, unlike the more nebulous appearances of the watchers he had glimpsed before. Thomas hastily replaced his spectacles, blinking against the rain that continued to spot the glass. Through the streaked lenses, he made out the form of a woman standing calmly in the downpour, seemingly unbothered by the water that plastered her clothing to her slender frame. She wore a simple dress of indeterminate color, its hem muddy from the increasingly saturated ground. Her dark hair hung in wet ropes around a face that held both youth and agelessness simultaneously, smooth-skinned yet etched with an experience beyond years. "You're the new teacher," she said, her voice barely audible above the rain drumming against the wooden structure above them. It wasn't a question. Thomas found himself at a rare loss for words, managing only a nod in response. The woman's presence felt qualitatively different from the watchers he had encountered previously. More immediate, more solidly anchored in the physical world, yet carrying the same sense of otherness that defied easy categorization. "They told me you returned what was lost," she continued, taking a step closer. Her eyes, Thomas now saw, were an unusual shade, amber flecked with gold, like sunlight through whiskey. "The little horse. It was a gift from my father when I was very young. I found it here, by the windmill," Thomas finally managed, his educator's instinct for clarity asserting itself despite the strangeness of the encounter. "Are you connected to the Watchers?" A smile flickered across her face, brief as the lightning that illuminated the clouds above them. "Everyone here is connected, Mr. Mercer. The Watchers, the town, the land itself. Some connections are just more visible than others." She reached into a pocket of her dress and withdrew something that she held out toward him, the red-banded stone he had left at the windmill the previous day. "They wanted you to have this. It's a seeing stone. Old magic, from before this land had a name in any language spoken now." Thomas hesitated before accepting the stone, which felt unnaturally warm despite the cool rain. "What am I meant to see with it?" "What's already there," she replied simply. "The Watchers have been waiting for someone who could look beyond what's easily seen. Someone who could help the town remember what it's forgotten." She glanced toward the rain-shrouded settlement below. "Places have memories too, Mr. Mercer. Sometimes they need someone to help them speak." Before Thomas could formulate a response to this cryptic statement, a tremendous crack of thunder sounded directly overhead, causing him to flinch instinctively. When he looked back, the woman was gone, with no indication of which direction she might have departed in the circular shelter of the windmill's base. The rain continued unabated as Thomas examined the stone in his palm. It appeared ordinary enough, smooth from water wear, likely from a riverbed originally, with that distinctive band of red mineral running through its center. Yet as he turned it in his hand, a curious effect occurred. When viewed from certain angles, the stone seemed almost transparent, the red band glowing with a light that had no obvious source. "And so, partner, as our tale rides off into the sunset, it's time for you to rest your weary bones beneath the endless prairie sky. Let the sounds of the west be your lullaby tonight, from the gentle crackle of the campfire to the soft prairie winds and the distant song of nightbirds, all flowing uninterrupted, with no advertisements to break the peace of your slumber. Sweet dreams, cowpoke, and may your trail lead to peaceful pastures tonight."